had removed each and every one of those attachments, and I'm pleased to relinquish some time to the gentleman, but I do need to know how much time I have.
The gentlelady has 9 minutes.
5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Serrano.
I thank you for the time, and I congratulate you on continuing to be the representative that you are for the District of Columbia. Let me, in the short time that I have, be very brief and to the point. This may be one of the least known issues in the United States, the whole issue of how Congress treats the District of Columbia. Understood that there are constitutional provisions, but constitutional provisions for Congress to oversee the District of Columbia does not mean that you should mistreat the District of Columbia. And I think it's important to note something that happened when I became chairman of the subcommittee that oversees the District of Columbia, and that is that I took it very personal. For you see, I was, like so many New Yorkers, I was not born in New York. I was born in Puerto Rico. And I was raised in New York, and I represent the Bronx in Congress. Puerto Rico, as some may know, everyone should know, is a territory of the United States. Some would say a colony of the United States. So the one thing I didn't want to do was be chairman of this committee and treat Washington, D.C. the way the federal government sometimes has treated my birthplace, and where I found myself, as so many other folks, with the United States as this country you love, and then Puerto Rico as your loving birthplace, and knowing they are attached, but somehow Puerto Rico doesn't get treated equally. So I said publicly, to the amazement of some and the laughter of others, that I was going to be the first member of Congress to ever relinquish power. I didn't want more power. I wanted to give up power. I wanted less and less to do with the District of Columbia. Let them govern themselves. And so the first thing we did is we found out that we were not allowing the District of Columbia to have a sensible approach to the HIV/AIDS issue epidemic by not allowing a syringe exchange program. Now, it's important to note what we're talking about here. You have monies that are raised locally by Washington, D.C., and then you have federal dollars. And what happened was that Congress for years was saying you can't use federal dollars for certain programs, and you can't use local dollars either for certain programs. Now, this is the part that gets a little political, and I'm going to try to be as fair and as balanced as possible, to quote somebody else. I believe that some members of Congress who did not wish to discuss these issues back home or could not fight these issues back home used the District of Columbia as the experiment by which they could say, abortion, I'm against abortion. Where? In the District of Columbia. Needle exchange, oh, I don't accept that. Where? In the District of Columbia. Same-sex marriage, oh, I'm totally against that. Where? In the District of Columbia. And they couldn't go back home and accomplish these things in their districts, but they imposed it on the District of Columbia. My role, I felt, and I did accomplish it, unfortunately that may change soon, was that little by little I got bipartisan support, both parties, to remove, under your leadership, and I'm being honest about that because you pushed and you pushed and you pushed, under your leadership, to remove these riders, to let them decide what to do with the HIV crisis, to let Washington, D.C. elected council members and mayor decide what to do with so many issues. That's all we did. We still kept the constitutional provisions. I don't go around rewriting the Constitution. Now what I think will happen, and we begin to see, is a desire to once again use Washington, D.C. as the experiment or the place where you do these things that you can't do back home. And so I would say to my colleagues, if you're strong, and I respect you on the issue of school vouchers, if you're strong on the issue of not letting women make choices in their lives, if you're strong on the issues of what rights or lack of rights gays should have, if you're strong on all these issues, fight them at the national level, fight them back home. Don't single out the District of Columbia as this experimental ground by which you can say that you accomplished these things when in fact you did not. The last one we had is the one that the public would really understand. The last one, which got lost in this budget that we just did, is the one that simply said that they could approve their own local budget without having Congress say yes or no. Now picture throughout this country, there are people watching us right now throughout this country who have local school board budgets, who have local fire department budgets, who have local town and city and county budgets. They get their dollars from federal funds, from local funds, from state funds, but they don't come at the end of the budget process and say, members of Congress from all over the world, can you please approve my budget? No. And I don't think they should be treated that way. And so I hope that the changes we made remain in place, but above all, I hope that we respect the citizens, the American citizens who live in the District of Columbia, the residents who live here. And lastly, we were elected to be members of Congress, but I was not elected to be the mayor of Washington, D.C., and I was not elected to be a member of the Washington, D.C. City Council. They have their own government. They can govern themselves well. They have their own finances. Let's give them the respect they deserve, and I hope as time goes on, these victories that we had, not for us, it's not going to get me reelected in my district, but for the people in Washington, D.C., that they stay in place. And again, to my colleagues, if you want to make these points, make them back home, make them at a national level. Don't pick on the residents of D.C. to make your point. And I thank you again.
I very much thank the gentleman, not only for his remarks today, but for the extraordinary work he did. He's right, I was pushing, but he was the real pusher. He was the man at the steering wheel, and he kept doing it until all those riders got off. And I want to thank the gentleman, yes, from New York, but who's not forgotten his roots, the gentleman's roots in Puerto Rico, because his roots have enabled him to empathize with people who may not have the kind of democracy he holds up to be emblematic of this country. So you don't have to be one of us, it seems to me, to feel what we are feeling. You have to think about your own roots, about what matters to you, and about the particularly the issues that have driven you in your life. And I think you will come to the conclusion that you should not expect from others what you would not have wanted for yourself. And I want, when you mentioned, when the gentleman from New York mentioned Puerto Rico, he also reminds me, time gone already?
Our gentlelady's time has expired.
Could I give the gentleman 5 minutes of my time coming? He said 5 minutes of his time. I'm the half hour. We switched. Yeah.
The gentlewoman's 30 minutes has expired.
Yeah.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the privilege of being recognized to address you here on the floor of the House. And been some dramatic changes that have taken place in this country and dramatic changes that have taken place in this Congress. I believe that, thank you very much. I believe that as we move forward, we're going to have some significant debates here on the floor. I look forward to the regular order component of this that's being initiated by Speaker Boehner. The process of using the committee process, the hearing process before committees, the markup before subcommittees, the markup before full committees, and bills going up to the Rules Committee after they've been approved by the actual standing committees, and that'd be the same bills that are passed by the committees that arrive at the Rules Committee, where the Rules Committee can work their will and, wherever possible, provide for an open rule, so that we can have the maximum amount of debate here on the floor, so that members can have their will debated and require an up or down vote, recorded vote, on their issues. That's not something that has been going on in this Congress. It's diminished each of the last 4 years. And the more than 2 centuries old, not necessarily a rule, not necessarily something written into the rules, but the practice and the tradition of open rules on appropriations has been essential to allow members to have their voice. And I'm thankful that that's the new tone of this Congress. It's been a great frustration to me and many other members, Democrats and Republicans alike. But so we're here today, Mr. Speaker, with on the cusp of a great big decision for this Congress. And as we make this transition from the era of Speaker Pelosi to the era of Speaker Boehner, and as he lays out the parameters of let the House work its will, and let's go back to a regular order as it was devised and approved in the constitutional structure by our founding fathers. With all of those parameters in mind, we have coming up before us a continuing resolution. And the pressure points that we have, the opportunity to bring leverage has been envisioned as the Constitution sets up Article 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. And here we are. The taxes and appropriations need to start here in the House of Representatives. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll just make this point, and it's an unequivocating point, and that is that unless the House approves of federal appropriations, there shall be not a dime spent by the federal government otherwise. So whatever we do here, and we will bring a budget through, and it will be a far more fiscally responsible budget than the non-budgets that have been processed in previous Congresses and the extension by CR, not by the legitimate appropriations process. But there will be a budget, and that budget will cut current spending significantly. And it probably won't be enough to satisfy me, but the budget process is another essential component of what we're doing here. And another component of it is to be able to legitimately fund the balance of this fiscal year. If we do nothing, if this Congress doesn't act, if the House of Representatives doesn't act, Mr. Speaker, then the federal government will go into an immediate and automatic shutdown at midnight on the night of March 4th of this year. That was the provision that was written into the continuing resolution last December when Democrats and Republicans got together and compromised. If you remember, the Senate was going to pass that huge omnibus bill. All of the wish list of the departing senators and those that hadn't been up for election, the big spending bill that was just grotesque in its vision when you look through all the dollars they were going to spend in the Senate and send it over here. Thankfully, the American people rose up, jammed the switchboards in the Senate, and even those hanging on the fence decided that they would get a hold of their better responsible nature, and they decided to pull down that huge omnibus spending bill. And so we ended up with a small continuing resolution, a continuing resolution that funded the government from the, remember the exact date of the expiration of the last one, but in December, whenever we passed this, through January and February and into the 4th of March. Now, some of us anticipated they would try to pass a CR for the end of the fiscal year, and that didn't happen. And a lot of us would have liked to spend less money up to this point. But in that CR, there isn't any funding that funds Obamacare. Even though Obamacare has passed and it's been signed into law and it's the law of the land, there's not funding going forward in the CR that we're operating the government on today. If that had been, the funding that was called for had been in the CR, there would have been about $1 billion appropriated in the continuing resolution that passed last December and expires this March 4th. That money was not put into the bill because they needed the votes of then the seated Republicans and some Democrats to vote for the continuing resolution. So the old Congress, the 111th Congress, didn't vote to willfully fund the implementation of Obamacare. Now we're faced with that the prospect of a continuing resolution coming before this Congress that's been announced to be 5 times greater than any appropriations bill ever voted on by this Congress before, and perhaps 4 times greater than any cuts that have been offered before. Well, that's because the whole string of 13 or so appropriations bills get packed up into one, and all that spending that's normally spread out over about 13 and perhaps a supplemental or two, packaged up into one bill with all that money in it. That's why it's that big. But in it, well, I think it's unlikely that there will be a line item anywhere in it that will fund Obamacare, but I don't see resistance either from someone bringing an amendment that would declare that none of the funds in this CR shall be used to implement or enforce Obamacare. That's pretty close to the language that I have advocated for, ever since last March, when I first introduced the repeal legislation to Obamacare. And by the way, Michelle Bachmann and I were within 3 minutes of each other in exactly the same language to initiate the repeal of Obamacare. We worked together on this with others, Connie Mack and others. Jerry Moran in the United States Senate today has been one of the leaders on repealing Obamacare without hesitation and actively and aggressively. There are a lot of supporters across the board. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to lay out the strategy that I have planned here on the repeal of Obamacare in sequence so that people that think chronologically like myself can put this into the right context. And that is this. I spent about a half a year of my life fighting the passage of Obamacare. When it finally passed and was signed by the President, the night it passed here, I went out off the balcony and down into the lawn on the South Lawn where there were thousands of people yet there pleading, keep your hands off of my health care. And I said to them that night that we would start the repeal process the next day. Now, I went home exhausted thinking I would sleep until I was rested up, and that didn't last very long. I got up and wrote the request for the repeal, as did the Congresswoman from Minnesota, Mrs. Bachmann. And we submitted those repeal requests at the opening of business that same day because it was after midnight when Obamacare passed. It was on that time, the strategy that I'd put together then was that we would file a repeal bill, seek the maximum number of co-sponsors to repeal Obamacare, and then, Mr. Speaker, move forward with a discharge petition to seek to get 218 signatures on that so that then Speaker Pelosi couldn't block the repeal from coming to the floor. We followed through on all of that and peaked out at 107, well, to the point where we peaked out at 178 signatures on the discharge petition that could have circumvented the Speaker seeking to block the repeal of Obamacare. That discharge petition was one of the tools that was useful in winning the majority in November 2nd of this past year. And there are members here that openly say they wouldn't be here if they didn't have the discharge petition to point to their opponent and say, sign the discharge petition. If you're serious, if you're against Obamacare, here's the vehicle to repeal it, sign it. A number of those who did not and would not were voted out of office. And we have a new freshman class here that is 96 strong. 87 of them are Republicans, and I know of none of the 87 that did not run on the repeal of Obamacare. I don't have confirmation, Mr. Speaker, but I believe that every one of the freshman Republicans, the 87, ran at least in part, if not centrally, on working to repeal Obamacare. The next phase, after winning the majority so we could actually bring legislation to repeal Obamacare, the next phase was to bring a repeal bill here to the floor of the House. And I wanted it to be H.R. 1. It turned out to be H.R. 2. I don't know what H.R. 1 is yet, Mr. Speaker, but I'm very, very happy that the leadership took that high a priority to hold a vote here on the House to repeal Obamacare so early in the first session of the 112th Congress. And we saw a vote here that was bipartisan, and it was unanimous among Republicans to repeal Obamacare. That is a very sound, a ringing, sound rejection of Obamacare by the American people as a result of the election on November 2nd, by the people they sent here, 87 new freshmen Republican, many of them very, very solid. And then, after H.R. 2 passed the House with unanimous Republican support and bipartisan support, Mr. Speaker, it went over to the Senate where they said, well, it can never pass over here, and it's just simply a it's symbolic vote. Well, the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, did force a vote and forced a vote on the repeal of Obamacare, and it would have taken 60 votes to break the filibuster under those rules. Well, every Republican in the United States Senate voted to repeal Obamacare. So we're in this situation today, Mr. Speaker, where if you look in the House and in the Senate, with far larger Republican numbers than we've had in past years, every Republican in the House and the Senate has voted to repeal Obamacare, every single one. And they're serious, and they want to get the job done, and their constituents insist that we get the job done as well. And so now that we have taken this position that we are, all of us, for repealing Obamacare, and consistent with two-thirds of the American people, if we voted to repeal it, it would be completely inconsistent for us to vote then to turn around and fund Obamacare. Well, if the CR has language in it that allows for funding of Obamacare, then a vote in support of the continuing resolution is a vote that funds the very thing that we voted to repeal, which would be inconsistent. And I do not believe that we will have inconsistent members here in the House of Representatives. I think they voted to repeal Obamacare. I think they're happy to vote to cut off the funding to Obamacare. And I believe that we'll have a universal support for that among our conference. And I believe the Senate, if they have an opportunity for the vote, would do the same thing. Down party lines, perhaps, but they do the same thing. But herein is the difficulty, Mr. Speaker. And it's this, that the funding that might otherwise be in this continuing resolution, or may perhaps actually come out tomorrow in it, is not very large in comparison to the overall cost. The chairman of the Budget Committee has said that the spending under Obamacare is $2.6 trillion. $2.6 trillion. Now, there's taxes enacted by it, and we know how the CBO scored the information that they were given. But $2.6 trillion in spending would be shut off if we repealed Obamacare today. And we have voted to do so in the House. The Senate wasn't successful. The President likely would veto. It is his signature bill. It's his identity. He's the one that called it Obamacare at the Blair House February 25th, and now it's in our dictionary. My spell check spells it out for me, Obamacare. But in any case, the $1 billion or so that might be cut out of Obamacare in the CR, if we say none of the funds that are written into this bill can be used to implement or enforce Obamacare, that $1 billion pales by comparison to the funds that are automatically appropriated that are written into the Obamacare bill itself. And it is an unusual practice to have that happen. When you have a large authorization bill like Obamacare come through, generally it authorizes the appropriations. They're authorized to be appropriated under this section, X many dollars, to go to implement or enforce the various provisions of Obamacare. That's where the money is. And the real money that's up in that's automatically appropriated. Obamacare anticipates and authorizes trillions of dollars to be appropriated to fund it, and it authorizes the collection of, I believe, trillions of dollars in fees and taxes to fund it over time. But the automatic appropriations that are unusual, but written into Obamacare, that a lot of people didn't know was in there when it was voted on, they will automatically appropriate a number that approaches or exceeds $100 billion in automatic appropriations. We're crunching these numbers now, and I have to qualify these numbers, Mr. Speaker. And our low number is down around $65.3 billion. Our upper number is up around $107 billion. CRS doesn't have a number. CBO doesn't have a number. Apparently nobody has pressed them to produce the numbers of the automatic appropriations in Obamacare in all this time. So we're taking this apart and putting it back together, and that's why the range is, it's my shop doing the math on this range, $65.3 billion on the low side, $107 billion on the high side. Let's just call it $100 billion for round figures, Mr. Speaker. We could come here on the floor next week and debate a CR, and we could see an amendment come that's in order that would cut off all funding in the CR that would be used to fund Obamacare. If we do that, we're cutting off about $1.2 billion in spending. If we bring an amendment that shuts off all the funding that's automatically appropriated in Obamacare, and if we're successful, we shut off maybe $100 billion that is be used to implement and enforce Obamacare. $1 billion versus $100 billion, a 1% solution versus a 100% solution. And if we don't use the 100% solution, then $100 billion, as many as or perhaps more, will be aggressively used by the Obama administration to implement and enforce Obamacare. And if they do that, the cancerous tumor that's growing because of what it does to our liberty and our freedom sends its roots down deeper, and it gets bigger and stronger and harder to eradicate. That's part of the strategy. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am hopeful that leadership and the chairman of the Appropriations Committee will get together. And sometime tonight, as they put the finishing touches on the CR legislation that they say will come out tomorrow, that they will write into the bill the language that I have proposed. And since we deal with 2,500-page bills here in the House, and we're chastised if we don't read and understand every word of them, I have an amendment here that I can read every word of, and perhaps it can be understood by everyone in America. This is the amendment that shuts off the automatic appropriations and to Obamacare. And here it is this. Notwithstanding, now first I should say, and I quote, notwithstanding any other provision of law, comma, none of the funds made available in this Act or any previous or subsequent Act may be used to carry out the provisions of Public Law 111-148, comma, Public Law 111-152, comma, or any amendment made by either such public law, period, close quote. That's the amendment, Mr. Speaker, that shuts off not just the funding in the CR to Obamacare, but it shuts off the self-enacting automatic appropriations that were, I believe, inappropriately written into the Obamacare bill and the reconciliation package that came over from the Senate as part of their deal. That's why I gave you two bill numbers instead of one, but they encompass what we commonly refer to as Obamacare. That's the amendment that needs to be made in order here on the floor that allows the House to work its will, that allows the House to work within order under the rules. And if it's not written into the bill, and by the way, regular order is holding committee meetings, holding hearings, holding subcommittee markups and subcommittee appropriations. Chairman Rehberg would be seated at one of those markups, I would think. And that would be useful, a full Appropriations Committee markup. At all of those stops, there would be an opportunity to introduce this language in committee and succeed, I believe, in dealing with a parliamentary challenge. Or if it's written into the base bill, certainly there would be no parliamentary challenge. And if this goes out of the Appropriations Committee up to the Rules Committee and doesn't have my language in it, at that point the Rules Committee can protect this language, Mr. Speaker, from a point of order. But if I bring this language to the floor in an appropriations bill, I know that I'm facing a challenge, the parliamentary challenge to this language. And it will be hard for the House to work its will if we get to the point where we have a parliamentary challenge on a piece of language that mirrors the will of the American people, mirrors the wishes of the American people, and mirrors the will and wishes of the members of Congress, the majority members of Congress, and mirrors the will and the wishes and the votes of 100% of the Republicans in the United States House and the United States Senate, and it's bipartisan, at least in the House. That's the endeavor that we need to be successful with, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very determined to have this kind of debate and find a way to have this vote. And if we're blocked from a vote that's essential to work the will of the House, how then can we say? How then can we say that the House has worked its will if the House has been denied an opportunity to work its will? And I know there are arguments on both sides, Mr. Speaker, but I would point out that the language that I have read into the record is not a precedent. It doesn't stretch the rules or the history or the traditions of this House. It doesn't stretch any written rule that I know of. It does, and it's this. There's ample precedent in the form of the funding that was the appropriations bills that were used to shut off the funding for the Vietnam War. Now, I disagreed with the decision back then. And I remember reading about it in the news in 73 and 74. In fact, my recollection says also 75, but I don't happen to have those notes, Mr. Speaker. And But I do have the notes to draw from the a report by CRS out of the congressional record. I'm saying that we can bring an amendment that shuts off all funding, notwithstanding any other section. All of the automatic funding that was enacted by Obamacare can be shut off in an appropriations bill in a continuing resolution. It can happen next week in the United States Congress, and we can put an end to Obamacare then until such time as we elect a president who will sign the repeal, and as hopefully the first act of office in January of 2013. That's my hope and my wish and my work. But for those who might wonder that this is language that stretches the parameters of tradition, it completely does not. And here are two examples of the House of Representatives and concurring with the United States, and the Senate concurring. And here's one, a supplemental appropriations bill, not a CR, but a supplemental appropriations bill that is in 1973, and actually the date on it is August 15th of 73, and it says this, that none of the funds herein appropriated under this act may be expended to support directly or indirectly combat activities in or over Cambodia, Laos, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam by United States forces, and after August 15, 1973, no other funds heretofore appropriated under any other act may be expended for such purpose. So, Mr. Speaker, this supplemental appropriations bill that's dated enactment of August 15, 1973, and signed by the President July 1st of 73, says that none of these funds and no funds in the pipeline can be used to support directly or indirectly combat activities in Vietnam. If there were bullets that were on the way to be unloaded on the dock at Da Nang, they put the brakes on them and they went back. Now, those funds were on the way. They shut them down. Now, that doesn't mean they stopped everything, but none of those funds that were unobligated, would be a better way to put that, were allowed to be used by this act of Congress in a supplemental appropriations bill. Yes, the precedent exists. Yes, we can do this. Yes, it is a common practice, Mr. Speaker. And if those might think that this is a rare exception, I would go on down the line to another piece of legislation which actually was a CR, a continuing resolution. And this is dated 1974, July 1st of 74. And this language in the continuing resolution then says this, quote, notwithstanding any other provision of law on or after August 15th of 73, no funds herein or heretofore appropriated may be obligated or expended to finance directly or indirectly combat activities by United States military forces in or over or from off the shores of North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. There's the language again, no funds herein and no funds heretofore appropriated may be obligated or expended directly or indirectly. That's an all-encompassing example of language that we've used as a template to shut off the funding that's automatically appropriated within Obamacare, and I think inappropriately automatically appropriated within Obamacare. That's where I stand on this, Mr. Speaker. And for those who think that's an ancient piece of legislative history and something that hasn't been used in the modern era and so therefore isn't a model or a precedent, we go back 200-plus years for those things, and I don't have trepidation about the Constitution that was ratified in 1789. But just in the 110th Congress, the first 2 years of Nancy Pelosi's Congress, Mr. Speaker, she forced 44 votes. They might have been some in the Rules Committee. Most of them came to the floor. 44 votes by this United States Congress that were designed to unfund, underfund, or undermine our troops. And I have those all on record on a spreadsheet with hyperlinks to the language and the vote results. And we stood here and fought this off through that 110th Congress because the effort by the then Speaker was to end the war in Iraq by shutting off all the funding and forcing us to bring our troops back home again. I'm very thankful that George Bush prevailed in the surge, and we have the optimistic situation in Iraq that we have today because of that decision that was made by George Bush. But it wasn't with any help from Speaker Pelosi, who forced 44 votes, many of them, and I have not scored it in this fashion, but probably most of them followed down the same lines as the legislative procedure that I'm advocating here. And so, Mr. Speaker, this is a very sound practice. It's a very constitutional practice. It's tried and it's true and it's been effective, and it put the end to the Vietnam War. And we can put an end to Obamacare if we bring language either as written into the bill, or if we'd go back and have an Appropriations Committee meeting, which I don't expect will happen, or if the Rules Committee protects my language so that the amendment can be legitimately debated here on the floor of the House and we can have a recorded vote. We can shut off 100% of the implementation and enforcement of Obamacare. If we don't take those steps, this Congress will not be allowed, then at that point will not have been allowed to work its will, and we have the chance to shut off $1 billion, which amounts to 1% of the overall appropriations that are automatically enacted by Obamacare. So we can come with a 1% solution and posture ourselves as we provided a solution, or we can come with a 100% solution with the best tools that the House has now, do the best job, write the toughest bill that we can, send it over to the Senate, because we know this. It's going to get worse in the Senate, and they're going to leverage back on us. And if it were just me, we could hold our ground. But it isn't just me. And so, Mr. Speaker, my advice to my colleagues, whom I adore the privilege of serving with and whose judgment and statesmanship I greatly respect, is this. We can't have people blink in this Congress, not when the destiny of America is at stake. And if you're wondering about blinking, just sign up with me. Wait till I blink. And when I do, I guarantee my eyeballs will be dry and so will yours. But we must hold our ground. We must not blink. We must send the language over to the Senate that cuts off all of the funding of that up to and perhaps exceeding $100 billion that would be used to implement and enforce Obamacare. They'll be used aggressively by the Obama administration to send the roots down and grow this malignant tumor and metastasize this malignant tumor. We can pull it all out by the roots. We can do so if we move my amendment and make it an order under the rule or write it into the bill. And if not, the American people look back on this time and say, where were you when it was time to stand up for the will of the American people? Mr. Speaker, I've had my say. I appreciate the privilege of addressing you here this afternoon on the floor of the House of Representatives. I entreat my colleagues to join with me, and let's get this job done. Let's repeal Obamacare. Let's pull it out by the roots, lock, stock, and barrel, a 100% repeal, not a 1% repeal. I yield back the balance of my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the Chair recognized the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walz, for 30 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past several weeks, I've had the incredible privilege and honor to be traveling up and across my district, the 1st District of Minnesota, from the plains of Worthington to the Mississippi River Valley at Winona. Listening and holding grocery store stops and hearing what the American people are talking about. They're not talking a lot about Obamacare. They're talking a lot about jobs. They're talking a lot about moving the country forward. And this is a place, I have to tell you, it was 18 below zero yesterday when I left. These are hardy folks. They're used to weathering tough times. They're also the place that gave root to, in a collective effort, the Mayo Clinic. They're also a place that is one of the top leading producers of food for this nation and feeding the world. Also a place where we generate the 4th largest of any state in the country, the 4th largest amount of wind power, and innovating down that road. And to be able to walk those streets, to go to those grocery stores, and in Mankato, where my office is located, Mankato, Minnesota, you hear a lot of people talk about Main Street. That was the Main Street Sinclair Lewis was talking about. That's where he lived when he wrote his famous novel about what it means to grow up in rural America and what it means to collaborate together. Things like the national debt. Talk about how we invest in our infrastructure. How do we keep our schools strong? How do we make sure we care for our veterans? How do we keep this nation safe by adhering to our ideals of freedoms and liberties and being that beacon for the rest of the world? Those are the things that people were talking about. While we're seeing some improvements in an economy that no one would argue by early 2008 was the worst economy we'd seen since the Great Depression. And for those who said, I guess we should have done nothing, I'm here to tell you today is I'm glad we're not repeating the Great Depression. I'm glad we're not seeing our markets collapse all the way, and I'm proud of the work we did to move back. Now we're seeing exports go up. We're seeing GDP grow. We're seeing consumer spending strong over the holidays. But I have to be very honest with you. The people who came to see me in those grocery stores in Owatonna and Worthington, Minnesota, those don't really matter if you don't have a job. If you don't have a job to pay for groceries, if you don't have a job to pay for the gas in your car to get to work, those are the things that matter. So I have to tell you, these people know something about struggling through tough times. Their ancestors went to those plains of Minnesota and carved out not only a living, they carved out world-class agriculture production, world-class delivery of health care, world-class innovations in manufacturing and energy on the premise that this country provided incredible opportunities, but we couldn't do it alone. We needed to do it in a collective effort to view the future and to bring the best out in individuals. So as we face these challenges and as we pay down debts that have been being generated for decades, and when Dick Cheney said in the Vice President's office and said we prove deficits and debt don't matter, he couldn't have been more wrong. They do matter. But we can't be penny wise and pound foolish with our children's future. It makes no sense to talk about paying down the debt if we're going to collapse our education system, our investment in science and technology. If we're going to let our infrastructure deteriorate, we will never pay the debt down. Because what's happened is the revenues have shrunk. The pie has shrunk. Instead of trying to figure out how to carve up a smaller and smaller pie, let's bake a bigger pie. Let's get a handle on our energy needs. Let's create homegrown energy and quit sending $1 billion a day to foreign nations who hate us. They will hate us for free. We can keep the money at home and create jobs. We can create the security we need to make sure that when great revolutions on democracy rise up in Egypt, we're watching it based on what's best for human rights, what's best for the stability of the world, not worrying about what the price of oil is going to do when we can get that right out of the Midwest with our innovation. So when watching this,
one moment.
Sure, I'll yield to the gentleman.
I very much appreciate it. And
absolutely.
I do this only to suggest that I missed the time when Ronald Reagan was being considered on the floor.
Absolutely.
So
I will yield my time to the gentleman.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I'm asking for 1 minute to suggest to my colleagues that one of the thrills of my lifetime was to serve with Ronald Reagan as Governor of California and as President of the United States. Reagan meant it when he said there is no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. President Reagan's contributions on behalf of freedom around the world are unparalleled since the end of World War II. There is no more Cold War. There is no more Berlin Wall. There is no worldwide threat of communist dictatorship because of the leadership of President Reagan. And with that, I would ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and place it at the appropriate place in the record. And I thank my colleague.
Without objection.
Absolutely. I thank the gentleman for his words, and I do think there's lessons to be learned there. Going out and getting back to traveling throughout my district, the one thing I can tell you, the country's watched this, and the folks who said in this institution, I can tell you, we get enamored with. I had no illusions. When I was elected in 2006, with no elected experience, a high school teacher, never ran for office, didn't know my county chair, and I think most of my students didn't know my political affiliation. What they knew was I cared for the community, I served in the National Guard, and I wanted to get things right. I wasn't under any illusion that people elected me based on Democratic ideology. They elected me because they wanted to hear about solutions. They wanted to hear how we work together to solve things. And when they did that in 2008 and expanded that, and then when the country swang back in 2010, I think my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, need to recognize the American public wasn't talking about critiques on Obamacare, and I heard my colleague mention we need to rip that cancer out by its roots. The cancer being treated is the young boy who sits in New Ulm, Minnesota, who didn't have care before and now is seen at the Mayo Clinic and is actually having a real cancer treated with the best quality care in the world. And the Mayo Clinic said this bill was a step forward, and we should not step backwards. So I think what I'm hearing from my constituents is, Can't we get beyond the partisanship? Can't we focus on those things that aren't imagined about ourselves and find the 90% of things that we share in common? And we should never give our passions on differences. We should never compromise on our core principal values. But we should always recognize the interesting thing about this great country is the previous speaker's district, and is a good friend of mine, borders mine. You might, when you hear us speak, think we're on the opposite sides of the world. We are not, neither are our constituents. But we need to come together with a recognition that the things we do here are meant to lay the framework. And that framework is the thing that's always made this country great, opportunity. Yes, there are safety nets when we're down. Yes, those things need to be there, and we talk about those things in a tough economy. But what the middle class cares about is opportunity. No one guarantees you success in this country, but we should guarantee the opportunity to achieve success on your own. And the way we do that is by ensuring we have world-class educational institutions, that no matter if you're in Windham, Minnesota, New York City, or Tampa, Florida, that child has access to it. Not only is it the right thing to do, it strengthens our nation. We can bring those things together. We can continue to innovate. The can-do spirit that has been here since the inception of this country understood that's how we needed to move forward. We need to find those common grounds. We need to lay the groundwork. Unfortunately, that rung of opportunity, that ladder of opportunity, by having safe and quality schools, by having transportation systems that serve all, by having affordable housing, by having access to basic health care, those were the rungs that allowed a person to pull themselves up and achieve success. I think of my own family in this case. When my father died and my brother was 8 and I was a young man out of high school, Social Security survivor benefits were there for my mother and my young brother. When people say in this country, you should pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, I agree. We just didn't have any boots. They were lent to us by Social Security, and we have paid it back ever since. My mother going on becoming a nurse, my younger brother going in and becoming a teacher like myself. I used the GI Bill that was afforded that was not just about enticing people to serve their nation. It was the idea that those who are willing to serve are going to be assets to our community and to our country. At this time of tough economic solutions, the easy thing to do is say, posture, we're going to have spending freezes. Well, that's fine. We have to get a control on spending, but don't leave the other side of the ledger out. The economy shrunk, and don't tell people this. If you freeze those numbers, be honest. You've just froze programs that should be cut to zero, and you've just froze programs that provide opportunity. We've got people now that seem to think after they climbed that ladder, after they believe they built that ladder themselves, they want to pull it up behind them. What we're talking about here is creating those opportunities, unleashing the American spirit, and winning the future. And I've seen it. I heard it in my district. There's a company called Angie's Kettle Corn. Some of you might have seen it, and my colleagues here, Mr. Speaker. It's sold in Costco and sold across the country. It started as a mom-and-pop business, literally, in a garage in Mankato, Minnesota. And this last week, they were on with Martha Stewart. They sold it with the Twin Stadium, and it's selling across the country now. That started with a passion, with a dream. It started with the ability to have local input and local ability to entice businesses to be there. It started by investments in transportation that allow you to move goods made and manufactured in Mankato, Minnesota to the coast as efficiently as possible. That's how we've always competed. That's how we've always outproduced the rest of the world. And at this tough time, when people are saying, we can't spend any money now because we have a national debt, I agree we need to get a handle on the debt. I've been saying it needed to be paid down for years, but if we make the mistake and don't invest in infrastructure, don't invest the correct ways in the future of providing opportunities, we are going to make drastic mistakes that will be hard to overcome. There's another great company in my district called Peerless Chain, and this one's fascinating because I think these things people forget about. The idea that you can no longer compete and manufacture in America because other countries simply are going to pay their workers less. Well, I'm not interested in a race to the bottom. Yeah, we're probably never going to be able to pay low enough wages to compete with China on wages, but we can beat them on innovation. We can beat them on quality products. We can beat them on moving things to market. And Peerless Chain is now one of the top producers of all forms of chain in the world. In fact, they provided all the chain to the booms that were on after the oil spill in the Gulf, protecting the Gulf Coast. That was a company founded by immigrant veterans after World War I who are now hiring veterans, manufacturing large, heavy-duty steel chains in Winona, Minnesota, stamping them made in America and shipping them to China. That's a future that makes sense. That's a future that creates jobs. That's something we can embrace. And I've got to tell you, the people working there, I don't give a dang if they're Democrats or Republicans. They don't care either. They're American jobs, American security. They're living the American dream. And you know what that dream is? Having the chance for an opportunity to maybe own your own home, maybe make it by the time you get there to be able to buy a boat or a snowmobile in our case, and be able to put your kids through school and know that those children have that opportunity. It's not good enough for us in this place to make policies that incentivize work to go overseas, to give tax breaks to those companies, and make it harder for Peerless Chain to produce right here. Those are the things we can do together. Those are the things that we can agree upon. Small businesses make it. They're the things that make it in America. They provided the jobs. They've done the things that need to be there. What you're hearing here, and I have to be very honest with you, is the false dichotomy of choices here is the government can't do anything right. The government is us. It's the school teacher from Mankato. It's the construction manager from Iowa. It's all of us together trying to decide. No, we're not going to do everything right, but together we can create something that is bigger than any individual person here. And I think as we move forward, we're going to have to be willing, all of us, myself, looking in the mirror first, to be able to reach across and find common ground, to find those things that create opportunity, and then have the courage to go forward and talk about investing. I want to give a couple examples of this investing and how, when people say the government can't do anything right or that's this, the trick is not to have the argument about big versus small government. The argument is about effective government. Does it do what the people want at the most efficient, effective cost available? Anything less, and now the police don't respond when you call 911. Now we aren't correctly making sure we're managing the ingredients in food as people eat, and we get contaminated foods or lead in our children's toys. Anything more will hamper business growth. So when I watch the President sit right up here underneath where the Speaker's at and talk about, let's get smart reforms. It's not an either-or about getting regulation one way or adding regulation on. An example of what we can do together to make things work happened in a hearing today. One of this nation's major banks, for whatever reason, and it will be determined in time, was foreclosing on the houses of service members who were deployed overseas. This Congress has determined that one of the things we will do if you're willing to serve this nation is give you protections while you're there serving in a war zone against excessive interest rates, foreclosure, and things like that. Because since the beginning of this country, we've understood if you're fighting in a war zone and you're worried about your family, your wife and child, whoever being thrown out of their house, it's pretty difficult to focus on your job. But they continued to do it, and they continued to make it happen. Well, today, that young Marine and his wife came today to testify in front of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, of saying, no, there needs to be safeguards over that. There needs to be oversight. And yes, a horrible word I'm hearing here, there needs to be some regulations enforced that we don't do that to our members. That's not anti-business. That's not hampering business growth. That's coming up to a collective decision that if you're going to serve this nation in war, then we should have a business ethic that says we're going to do the right thing since it's law. And I have to tell you, those are compromises we can come to. Investments. We have a project in southwest Minnesota. It's a combination with the gentleman who spoke before me and our friends in South Dakota. Southwest Minnesota, northwest Iowa, southeast South Dakota. About 800,000 people altogether in this area. A large number of them do not have access to drinking water. In 2009, I met with a woman who gets her drinking water from collecting it in a cistern when it rains and snows, still today. It's not poverty, it's necessity. There's no wells. So a project was designed, an incredible project of bringing together local municipalities, states, and the federal government to divert water from the Missouri River to the Lewis and Clark Rural Water Project. And this is not a nice-to-have thing if you think it's an amphitheater or something. This is drinking water and water for businesses. I have communities in my district that cannot add one single home because they don't have capacity for water to hook up to the sanitary sewers. I have businesses, large ones, some of the largest packing plants in the country that can't continue to expand and create jobs because they can't have access to water. So we came together on this, and here's what happened. The local municipalities and the states agreed in concert with the federal government to pay their taxes ahead to accelerate a project with the promise that the federal government would fund the program. And those promises were made, and then they were broken. And what ends up happening then is, as a member of Congress and those who posture on this floor, we certainly can't have earmarks. That means an elected representative of the people of South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa don't have the access to redress the grievance that we've invested millions of dollars, our citizens paying ahead, with the idea there would be some help. Yes, those tax dollars will come from across the country, but my state is one that is a net return on tax dollars. We send more to the rest of the country, but I understand how that benefits us all. We can create food and export it elsewhere. Manufactured goods are created elsewhere and sent to my district. That's the idea of the 50 United States. That's the idea of federalism, of not having, in many cases, I think some of my colleagues get confused between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of where we're at. That's a project where people say, we can't spend a penny on that. Now we will end up spending more money, stopping economic growth, making sure that people in this country don't have access to drinking water, all with the idea that we're going to be fiscally responsible. It will do nothing but add to the debt. It will do nothing but deprive people of a basic commodity in this country you'd like to believe you have access to, is water, and it was paid for ahead of time locally. Those are the types of things that we need to have honest discussions about. There is no doubt that we've got budgeting situations. If we do not handle the national debt, our children and grandchildren will pay a heavy price for it. They will pay a price in some very simple things. As interest rates begin to climb, their buying power will become less. Their ability and the dollars they make already are shrinking for the middle class. Our real wages are declining. They will have a lower standard of living. It will be harder to go to college. It will be harder to buy a house. It will be harder to buy a car. That all translates in to the American dream slipping a little further away. So we have a responsibility. Pay our fair share. That's why when the bill came up in December asking for changes to the tax code or whatever, I don't think it's that bad to ask that 140 million people needed to get the tax cut in a time of economic downturn that had to happen. That cost us money. There's no doubt about that. It will add to the debt. The idea behind that is that money will be spent. Businesses will only grow if consumers spend money and there's a demand for goods. The problem many of us had were the other half of that money went to 6,600 families. 154 million, 6,600 families. Yeah, let's slice it down the middle. There's always been a sense of fairness in this country. We're not saying. We applaud success. We applaud people who achieve greatness. But please keep in mind, if you have a large business and you're employing a large number of people, we're happy for you. But keep in mind, we're educating those children in our schools. We're getting those people to your job on our roads that all of us are paying for. There's always been the assumption that there would be a fairness to our tax code that you would pay back. All of those things create a balanced budget. They create economic growth, and they've done the one thing that America has done better than anybody else, provided innovation and opportunity of growth for the middle class to continue to achieve. So what we're going to see over the next couple years is a turning point in this country, I believe. Are we going to get it and figure it out what the American people said on November 2nd? I tell you, they didn't say in 2006, do it all the Democratic way. They didn't say it in 2008, do it all the Democratic way. And I can tell you they did not say on November 2nd of last year, do it the Republican way. They said solve problems, get together, move us forward, create the infrastructure and the opportunities for the middle class, and then get out of our way. Stay out of our civil liberties, stay out of our personal business, allow us to do that, and create the type of country that we were founded on, one that understood that Constitution was not a static document. That Constitution was one about the birth of a new nation, the idea that individuals, the audacious idea that you could take a high school teacher from Minnesota and plop them down in the very place where Abraham Lincoln spoke. Plop them down and say, go and speak. And I will tell you, when you sat down on this floor, Mr. Speaker, and you wonder, how in the world did I ever get here? The good thing is you meet all of your other colleagues and you say, how did they get here? And you understand the great diversity of this country. You understand that our strength lies in our ability to have different and competing opinions with a common goal, a strong, fair country with equal opportunities that rewards hard work, that awards achievement, but understands that you can't always control life circumstances. At times, there's going to need to be a safety net. And the idea that we're going to rip out Obamacare, please keep in mind, I don't want to go back to the days when 47 million of my fellow citizens have no access to health care. For several reasons. One, I don't think it's ethically right. Two is, I know I'm paying for it anyway when they go to the emergency room and it's more expensive. So why not get the preventative care in the best possible manner, deliver that care, and quit spending twice as much as any other nation and start using that money to invest in innovation and job creations. That's how we pay down the debt. That's how we move forward. That's how we start to get a handle on what the core values of this country are and the things that's always made us great. So we're going to have an opportunity. We're going to have an opportunity to discuss these issues. I'm disappointed when I was back home and I heard people talking about all these things, jobs, 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 the economy, the future. I came back last night to a bill that was never debated. You heard about this new open rule. Well, here's the fact. Not a single debate on it, not a single amendment, not a single minute of discussion on this floor. And you know what that bill was? The Patriot Act, determining as you as an American citizen if the government can listen on you. I don't know about you, but I hold a lot of those values, and I am very, very nervous when somebody's listening to my conversations. And I don't buy this. You don't have anything to hide. You don't have anything to worry about. That's nobody's business. There's legal ways to go about this. We can keep this nation safe by doing that. But the new majority who told us about how things had been done so poorly, the first time we had the Patriot Act up on the floor, we debated it for weeks. We talked about it. It was discussed. Last night it came in on a suspension calendar, and I'll have to tell you this. I applaud the people here who said no. And those people didn't say no to national security. They didn't no to say stopping terrorists. What they said no is we are not willing to sacrifice our liberties for a little bit of false security. We want that balance to be struck, talked about here, and agreed upon. So as we talk about jobs, as we talk about what's going to be going forward, bringing in the Patriot Act on Tuesday evening with no debate and voting for it on the floor just that quickly when a member of the Republican majority, a new member, somebody who I know because they ran against me on this, did you read the bill, did you read the bill, said he hadn't read the bill. But he voted yes anyway. And he said, well, we'll have time to work it out. That's what America was tired of. That's what America, if they were speaking out on November 2nd, was. And here's the thing. We have a choice. And I say we being me. We have a choice that's set on this floor. Are we going to be part of the solution? Or are we going to continue to push problems forward? I think the American people deserve better. I think that listening to that soldier today who did his duty, he needs a government that's speaking for him. It doesn't matter how big that bank is to get it right. And then here's the thing. I'm not saying that bank can't do good. In this instance, they did not. And I simply don't want to leave it to them to make the decision. So together, we've got some opportunities. We're going through some growing pains, but here's the thing. Our grandparents and our forebears made it through civil wars. They made it through the Great Depression. They made it through the Civil Rights Movement. They made it through there. We are the products of all that struggle. We are the ones that now have to rise to that challenge. We are the ones that have to get beyond the petty political bickering that can divide us for short-term political gain, but it's not looking towards the next generation. We have an opportunity. I saw it everywhere across southern Minnesota last week. I saw Republican and Democrat come together, and those people coming in that grocery store, one man came to me and said, well, at least I got the courage to come up here and tell you, Tim, I didn't vote for you. And I'm like, well, that's no big deal. Almost half the people didn't vote for me. But you're here. You're expressing your citizenship. You're expressing solutions that can go forward. That's how the country gets back together. And we shook hands. We talked about things that can be better. And we walk out of that grocery store thinking that tomorrow can be a better day. That's what the thought in this country has always been. The future and the ability for our children can be better than we're at today. We can handle our energy needs, and we can create those jobs at home. We can make health care accessible, pay for it, continue to innovate. We can manufacture and make it here at home and outcompete any nation in the world if we choose to invest in our greatest natural resource, our people. So now's the time to be smart on budgeting. pay the debt down, get a handle on things, get a handle on spending, make taxation fair, but don't shortchange the next generation. Invest in education, invest in infrastructure, invest in research. And I'm looking forward to the next 2 years, and I said the American public deserves nothing than the best that we have to offer here, the voices across this country offering up solutions, debating them in a fair manner on this floor, voting for them, and then realizing that just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean they don't love this country. Just because they don't vote the way you wanted to doesn't mean they're a communist or a socialist or un-American. What it means is we have the golden gift of being able to disagree, to debate on this House floor, and to take that debate to the American public in a civil, respectful manner with the understanding our neighbors love this country every as much as we do. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Under the Speaker's